Okay, I've got one end that is not live stitches, and that was my beginning cast on row. We just did a regular weaving cast on, and this other end is live stitches. So I'm going to show the bind off on this edge that has the live stitches. So I'm just going to turn it over and find the beginning, which is going to be right here. And I like to leave it with the right side out while I'm doing this, because these stitches want to roll outward anyway, and I can see all of my stitches, and it helps me fold it back so that I can get a good view of my stitches. Okay, so I need to take the tail, the long tail that I left, and thread it onto a yarn needle. And it's going to be a little fiddly at first because the tail is so long. But find the gap where you started and ended that first round. And to find your live stitches, you're always going to follow these little bumps. Let's see if I can get that closer. These little bumps go in and out of the live stitches. When you're working with this, if these stitches start hiding down there, don't mistake this one for the next stitch. It's always the live stitch that is at the top of this waist yarn, waist yarn bumps here. So if you lose a stitch, just follow these bumps in and out and you'll find the stitch. So just keep that in mind. So I'm going to try to hold this up to do the next step so you can get a clearer view of what I'm doing. If you've seen any of the videos online with knitting machines showing how to do the backstitch bind off, this is exactly the same, except for our stitches are being held by waist yarn instead of hung on the knitting machine. If you're doing it on a flatbed knitting machine, it's easier to leave it on the machine, but I find it hard on these circular machines to do anything at the machine, especially the ribbing. It just seems to get in the way, and it's a little bit more difficult for me. So I prefer to take everything off on waist yarn and do all the handwork off of the machine. So for this technique, we're always going to be working with 3 stitches at a time. And your number 2 stitch is always going to be the one that has the tail coming off of it. So I'm going to find the waist yarn bumps, and there's my number 2 stitch. And so I'm going to be counting right to left because I'm going in that direction. So this is going to be stitch number 1, number 2, and number 3. So to do the back stitch bind off, you go away from you through stitch number 1, skip stitch number 2, and come behind stitch number 3 and poke your needle toward you and pull it through. And at this point you need to pay attention to how tight you're doing your stitches, because you need to be consistent all the way to the end. So I'm creating a new little bump here at the front, so I want to size it the same size as the regular stitches that are already formed below, and try to be consistent with that. And pay attention to this top loop here that you've pulled through, because you don't want to confuse it with your number 1 stitch that's hiding behind it. So after I've finished that sequence, it's going to be repeated all the way around. Now I have a new number 2 stitch. This is now my number 2 because the tail is coming out from it. I'm going to follow my waist yarn bump down and locate my number 1 stitch that's hiding, and that's my number 1, my new number 1, my number 2, and my number 3. So when I poke my needle through the number 1, I don't want to go underneath this loop that I already created. I want to pick up my number 1 stitch and go above that loop. Skip number 2, come in behind number 3, and pull your needle through. and it's a little hard to establish the size of your stitches the first couple of stitches, so you need to adjust as you go until you get a few stitches in there. So here's my new little bump that I created, and it's about the size of these other stitches, so I'm happy with the way it looks. So here's my new number 1 hiding down there, my new number 2, my new number 3. Going to go in number 1 away from me, around the back, skip number 2, and come back in toward me on number 3. And it's very important that your tail of your yarn is always on this side. You don't want it flopped over to the other side because you'll be creating extra loops and knots. So always your working yarn and everything needs to be hanging in between you and your work. And size the stitches as you go. Don't pull too tight, just make them consistent. So I like to pinch my thumb between the 3 stitches that I'm over the 3 stitches that I'm working with, so I don't lose my place. There's my new number 1, number 2, and number 3. Going to go away from me on number 1, behind and skip number 2, and come up behind number 3 and back towards you. And continue all the way around doing that. And the good thing about this is you have complete control. Your stitches aren't going anywhere because they're being held by the waste yarn. If you need to stop or you don't pick this up for a few days, you can always come back to it. And you'll know where you left off because your tail is coming out from stitch number 2. Now, don't pick it up this way and go in the wrong direction. It's always going to be like you're looking inside of the tube, and it's going to be this top edge. So this is my number 2, and I can pick it up and continue where I left off and locating my stitch number 1. So I'm going to stitch a little bit longer on this. If you need to back up the tape to rehearse this, that's fine. Or you can actually rip this out if you don't like the way it looks, and you can start over. Because you do want this to be consistent so that it'll look like that E-wrap on the edge. I'm getting close to the end of my bind off, and you can tell these are the beginning. You can see that E-wrap going on there. I call it an E-wrap because it looks like one. And let me do the next few stitches. I'm going to follow my waste yarn down, find that number 1, and I'm going to come over here and grab this number 3 right there, which has already been included with the stitch previously. So it may look a little funny, but if you get confused, just follow your bump, the white bump around, or whatever color your waste yarn is. So I'm going in number 1 and back out through number 3, which is sharing a stitch with the part of the stitch with the one before it. But I want to go one more step because there is still a little bit of a gap there, so we want to finish this off. So I'm going to find my number 1, skip number 2, and go through that loop. Wait a minute, I grabbed the loop. That was a loop that I had created, so I don't want to grab that. Let's do that again. I've already gone through number 1. Let's just undo it so it'll be clear, because you want it to look consistent at the end. So let me get back where we were. And this is how easy it is just to rip out if you've made a mistake. You just have to rethread your needle. And you see I have a generous amount of yarn left over, but I'd rather have too much than not enough. So this is my number 2. Here's my number 1. Skipping number 2, and I don't want to grab that one because that's my big loop. I need to follow my own rules and follow that bump to find that original stitch, and it's right there. It's real easy to confuse these at the end. So let's locate our stitches again. This is number 1, number 2, and number 3 is kind of pulled up a little bit. So I'm going to go out or in number 1 and back out number 3. And that has closed that gap. So you'll see some consistency of your E-wrap stitch all the way around the edge. The next thing you would do is, with all knitting projects, is just weave in your tail and cut that off. And I'm just going to go ahead and get rid of it now. And then you would unravel these live stitches from your waste yarn, and you'll get down to the finished edge. So here's our finished edge, and it looks pretty nice now, but once it's steamed and blocked, this will be a very nice edge, closed edge. So I've left the other end to demonstrate the ribbing off of the machine, and this is a closed edge, but I'll show you how to remove this waste yarn after we finish the ribbing.